You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 61. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
So in this episode, we're going to offer a scenario that can happen with church leaders, invite you to walk through the emotions, thoughts, actions, and desired results so that you can practice emotional literacy in your congregation.
As a reminder, this episode is brought to you by the resources of Transforming Mission. This resource is designed to help you deepen your relationships with Christ, your congregation, and the community. You can find a free download to help you navigate the land of emotional literacy within your leadership and congregation at transformingmission.org/061. So before we jump into the scenario for today, let me remind you from episode 60 of a framework that we've been using, and that will help inform the questions that I'm going to be asking Tim in this scenario. The framework that we introduced in episode 60 goes like this. Our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions determine our results. Each one of those, our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions, we have control over our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions to get or work towards the desired results that we want to have. What we don't often have control over, if ever, are the circumstances. These are the brutal facts, the current reality of the situation that we find ourselves in. So facts are things like the size of your community. Sure, those facts can change, but you do not have any control over whether or not your community grows or your community shrinks. And when I say community, what I'm talking about is the area around where your local church is situated. So we're going to walk through a hypothetical situation or situations of local congregations that we have served, that we have worked with, to help you get a sense of how a conversation around emotional literacy may go in the life of a local church. Now, this is going to be a conversation between Tim and I, so you may be having a conversation with you and your leaders, so there might be more people involved, but we think you'll get a sense of what this is all about so that you can then lead a conversation with your local church and with your local church leaders. Let's jump into the scenario. So are you ready for the scenario, Tim?
I am.
And this is a scenario that we hear a lot in local churches. So this is not a specific congregation that we're talking about, but we will play out a few different circumstances to help you get the nuances of how this could all take place. So the scenario is this: because the church isn't growing, because it's not getting bigger and getting better, the pastor thinks, I'm not successful. So let's just brainstorm here for a minute. If you're a pastor and that's what the pastor is thinking, I'm not successful because the church isn't getting bigger and better, we're not growing, what does that pastor feel?
Well, I can imagine that there is disappointment, frustration, a feeling of failure.
They might be sad. They might even be scared.
So would they be afraid of the superintendent at that point?
That's exactly where I was going. What's the superintendent going to do? Are they going to move me because we're not growing? We're not getting bigger and better. How long am I going to be able to stay?
That's one of the stories we make up.
That is a story that we make up. The emotion around that would be just being scared or afraid.
Right.
So, Tim, pick one of those emotions And let's play with it just a little bit.
Okay, let me frustration, being frustrated.
You're stealing my emotion from the last episode. I'm kidding. So what does that emotion feel like for you? How does your body respond when you're frustrated? I talked in the last episode about pushing forward when I'm frustrated. That's how I respond. I have had to learn that when I'm frustrated, I don't need to push. What I need to do is take a step back. So how does your body respond?
Sarah, I think the initial response to that is that I shut down. But I don't shut down by not participating. I shut down by telling myself I'm being. There are times that my frustration comes around feeling like I'm being manipulated, and so I become aggressive. So I back out of whatever could be positive, and then set up my turf so that I can defend what I want. That's usually where my frustration goes.
So let me just check that I'm hearing you correctly. So I'm going to say it in a little bit different way, and you correct me if I'm not saying it in terms of how you really intend it. You protect your turf.
I protect my turf. Right.
Okay. You started to go there, but you didn't. What thought loops run through your mind when you're frustrated?
Yes, I usually I'm thinking of being frustrated. So I'm usually thinking of something like, if you're not going to pay any attention to me, or if I'm not important enough for you to listen to, then I just don't need to participate in this, and you don't need to come toward me any farther.
What's the result that you really want to have happen? Said differently, what's the future that you really desire in terms of the scenario that we're talking about?
Well, for me, I think immediately what I want is to be taken seriously, or to know that there's an end to not only the frustration, but for being stuck. And so that's the immediate result that I want.
What do you want for the church?
That's a standard answer. I want the church to be faithful to the mission. And so it's after I go through all of those feelings and thoughts that I come to the place of saying, well, this isn't going to get us to the mission. So if I'm going to get to the mission, what do I need to start thinking, and how does that make me feel?
And put some flesh on the mission for me. If you're frustrated because the church isn't growing and it's not what does it look like to live into the mission?
So if I'm honest about it, and I really begin to think more clearly, of course, it's in the context of the congregation. So let's just say I want, and you've taught me this to be more specific. I want 10 new people in the next 2 months to join a small group. Or I'd like for us to make 12 new contacts with people in the community. If I say those things, then I really have to step back and begin to ask what's realistic about it. But if I'm true to myself, I'm going to be asking, if I'm going to be faithful to the mission, I want to have 10 new people in small groups. Your question to me is going to be, if you only have 12 people, is 10 people realistic? Is that right?
Well, all I was going to say is So we haven't asked him, how big is this church that he is leading? How many folks does he regularly have participating in the life of the church? If you are leading a church and there are currently 12 people who participate in the life of the church, Tim's example of wanting 10 people in the next 2 months to join small groups probably isn't realistic, because you're looking to double the size of your church in the next 2 months.
But would it be, Sarah, that if all I have is 12, I could start with those 12 and say, let's try an experiment in living into the mission and see who would join that mission, that experiment?
Yes, hang on to that thought for just a minute, because I want to back up and walk through the process that we introduced in the last episode of what are you thinking, what are the feelings that you're having, and what do you need to do to make it happen? And in this conversation, well, I'm having this conversation with Tim as the leader of a congregation. You would be having this conversation with your leaders. So you might be having a conversation with your leadership team or your church council or your administrative board, whatever language you use for the group of leaders that help set the direction for the church. So let's back up and let me ask you, what do you need to think if you want to have 10 new people in the next 2 months join small groups?
So the first thing I need to do is to think that it's possible. I have to be able to see the possibility.
So if you have to think that it's possible, do you think that it's possible to have 10 people in the next 2 months?
It really depends on, again, as you've already said, the size of the congregation. So if I have the capacity to do that, yes.
Okay, so let's just say that your congregation is currently worshiping 120 people.
Then I think, yes, I think I have the agency to empower people to make that happen as the leader of the congregation. I feel good about the possibility that could happen. Yes. Okay. I'm encouraged by that.
What's the action that you're going to take? Because you can think that you can do it. You can think that it's possible. You can feel like you have agency, but if you don't do anything,
well, then I have to start working with the leaders. Number one, to see the kind of possibility that's there, and then we have to put a system in place. There's a system where we have to, reach out and receive people, welcome them, introduce them to Christ, connect them to one another. That's the disciple-making process we call hope.
What would your first step be if you want in the next 2 months 10 new people to join small groups? What is one possible new step? What is one possible step that you could take to move that desired result forward?
Well, the first thing I would do is to gather the leaders together to pray and identify a person that we could invite into a new adventure.
Okay. So if I was actually coaching you as a pastor, the last thing that I would say to you is, when are you going to do that by? When are you going to call that meeting by?
Only because you and I have done this before, I'd say, when are we going to talk again? I would say that based upon when my next leader team meeting, I would say that we would be engaged in that at our next meeting. So if that's next week, I'd say that I'd have it done by the end of next week. If it's the beginning of next month, I'd say it's the beginning of next month.
All right. So let's put a pin in that for just a minute and take another step back. And Tim, you started to allude to this. you just walked through what are the thoughts, the feelings, the actions, and the results that you want. The results that we wanted were those 10 people in the next 2 months to be a part of 2 small groups. And so we walk through what are the thoughts, feelings, and actions that we'd have to get there. Before any of that can happen, Tim has talked about this in previous episodes, is, what's your current reality? The language I'm going to use is, what are your circumstances? And what I mean by that is, what are the facts? What are the things that are out of your control that either support or negate what you're thinking, feeling, and your actions? So one circumstance might be, let's say you're in a rural area and you have a total of 450 people in the part of the county where your church is located and people might come to that local congregation from. There are 5 or 6 other churches in the area, and the percentage of people that are likely going to attend a Methodist church, let's say, is around 10%. Now, these numbers, folks, are from a community that I know. They are not universal truths, so don't hear this as a formula of what I'm saying. Let's say you currently have 75 people attending and actively engaged in your local congregation. Do you now think that having 10 new people in the next 2 months participate in small groups is realistic? If it's likely that 10% of the folks in the community will participate in the United Methodist Church, and it's a community of 450, so that means it's likely that there would be 45 people that would participate in the life of the church, and you have 75 already. Is it realistic in the next 2 months that you're going to add 10 more?
So is what you're telling me, Sarah, is that I shouldn't be so hard on myself with unrealistic desires and vision, that when I hear how other people do it and it works so well, and I come back to my congregation and it doesn't work, I don't necessarily need to see myself as a failure. What I need to be is realistic and work on it in a different way.
Right. I would say that the goal that you are trying to reach is out of alignment with what the circumstances around you are telling you. You already have more people engaged in the life of that church than are likely going to participate in the life of that church. So what would happen if you shifted the result that you're seeking to have? Now, of course, God can work in miraculous ways, and maybe that 75 will become 150, and maybe that 150 will become all 450, and people start coming to your area. There are always exceptions to every scenario that we talk about. But I wonder if in the circumstance that I just described, that perhaps your role in this season is really to shepherd and guide the congregation to grow in depth and maybe not in numbers.
I like that, because that's not part of the reason I like it is because it's not only realistic, but that's really what we ought to be about anyway.
Right.
Is growing in depth, not in numbers, but in depth of spirit and faith and in connection with the community.
I would say that if you identify your role as helping folks to grow in depth, if you're helping folks get connected to a ministry beyond the local church, or adjust their participation from simply participating in activities within the church to engaging in the life of the community, or maybe it's recognizing that your desire is out of alignment with the circumstances around you, so that you're helping them to deepen their relationships with Christ, all of those things end up taking care of any numbers that are going to happen.
Right.
When things are deeper, And when your relationships are aligned with what the circumstances or your current reality is around you, you can get a better check on how you are feeling and why you're feeling that way. So take what we've been talking about through the lens of what I just shared, that this is a community of 450 people. You already have 75 people who are participating. So stop beating yourself up about getting bigger. You are thinking things that are a projection of other people that are causing you to feel bad about something that is not even real. So go back and get straight about what the circumstances are so that you can get your thinking and your feelings and your actions in line with the results that you want. Again, this is all in the context of emotional literacy, that if you are feeling bad about something, take a step back and ask yourself, what are you thinking? And then take a step back even farther and ask yourself, what are the circumstances or the current reality of what is happening here? You want to take a different circumstance, Tim?
Sure. Let's say that you're in a community where there is at least one high school, maybe two. You get about 600 students every year, and you have 45 people in worship.
Retro.
So you're surrounded by people and lots of young people, but yet you only have about 45 people in worship. What do you need to ask yourself? Is it what needs to change? What's the disconnect of the church and the community? Or maybe ask yourself, do you value loving God and loving your neighbor? And how do these values, how do those operate within the congregation?
In that scenario, the circumstances around that local congregation, what I'm hearing you describe, Tim, is there's a disconnect between the local church and the current reality of the community that is around you. Because if you're graduating 600 students every year from a high school, that means it's a fairly substantial community. There are a lot of people in that community, and you have 45 people in worship. So there's something that is amiss there. If that's the fact that we know about our community, and there would be other facts about that, we would actually know how many people are in that local community. What am I thinking? If I'm thinking that my role as a leader, as a pastor of a congregation in a community like that, is to be in relationship with my community, to be Christ's presence in my community, it appears to me as something that's not happening right now. Something is going to need to change. I like your question about loving God and loving your neighbor, because I would wonder, are they even thinking about that? Are they thinking about how do we love God and how do we love our neighbor if we are 45 people in the midst of a large community? Now, hear me, folks. There's nothing wrong with 45 people. What I'm getting at is there are a whole lot more people in that community who you have the opportunity to share Christ's love with, and it sounds like it's currently not happening. So how can we move on that and make that happen in that community?
So without blame and shame, how do we ask ourselves the question, are we the church that this community needs? Are we actually, well, the question you asked in the previous circumstance is, what do you think is possible? And I'm guessing most churches that are 45 in a community like that are saying, well, it's possible we could have all kinds of people here. So the next question is, for me, are you willing to do what you need to do to be able to connect with those people? And so without blame and shame, how do we ask the question, or how do we go to the place instead of saying you should be able to do this, you're not doing it, and shift that to what is it, who do we need to be, and what is it we need to do to be the church this community needs?
I like what you're asking because you're thinking strategically. I'm going to back up a couple steps and ask folks, what do you think the purpose of the church is? Is the purpose of the church to care for you and you alone? Is the purpose of the church to be a place of care and concern for those of us who are here? Or are we to be a light that's shining in this community, sharing Christ's love with other people? I would ask the question to hear what people think the church is supposed to be about. Where are they at? And then I'd ask them, how are you feeling about that? Are we doing that? Because I think sometimes we think that people know what the church should be about, and they think it should be about something. Or it might not even be thinking about, it might not be about what the purpose of the church is, but they're feeling really good about the fact that their church takes care of the people who are a part of their family. And they're referring to their family as those 45 people, whether they're related by blood or not. That feels good. But now that they're stopping to think about it, it's crud. And we go back to the scenario that we began with the pastor feeling bad because the church isn't growing. That can be a motivator for change.
But if we don't have a healthy emotional literacy, if we're not healthy, it's hard to have the conversation that brings about the change.
So again, let me remind you, you're going to build the container to invite folks into this conversation. So if we're wanting to reach out into our community and we're wanting to help folks get connected to a small group, we're going to have to build the container to have that conversation and ask folks, what do you need to participate in this conversation? What's going to get in the way? And what does support look like? And after we've done that, then we're going to invite folks to ask the question, okay, if this is the result that we want, what are we going to need to do? How are we feeling about that? And what do we need to think? If you don't think that the church should be for people other than the 45 people who are currently there, it doesn't matter what you do. There aren't going to be 10 more people because people can smell the fact that you don't want them there. Now, you may never say, we don't want you here. You may say with all of the words, we're glad that you're here. But your actions communicate, this is about us. We are already the community that we need to be. So you might have to change what you're thinking.
So in the terms of circumstances, I know that circumstances, we've just given another little scenario of a circumstance, current reality. Is it better to instead of looking aspirationally at what we would hope would happen by not changing, is it better to say, I like the 45 people that I have and I really don't want to change, so that at that moment you can put a stake in the ground and say, okay, now we know where we are. If we're going to reach the other people in this community, what needs to happen?
Yeah, because until you're honest about what are you really thinking and feeling, if you feel threatened by all of the people that are in that community and you like your small community, you need to name that and own it, because you're never going to be able to move beyond it. And I would say you're going to sabotage anything that does move beyond it if you're not willing to be real in those moments about what you are truly thinking and feeling. Again, as a leader, you're going to need to create the space for people to be open and honest about what's going on inside of them and to be able to name that. And folks probably haven't stopped to think about it. So you're going to have to give some space and time to make that happen.
Well, I know, Sarah, that we've been talking about emotional literacy. The way we have been living as a church, and I'm talking about the larger system as a church, has not necessarily been tilted in that direction. So when we ask the question, we're 45 people in a community where there are many more people, do we want to reach the community? We don't answer that question based upon mission. We answer that question based upon years of thinking of what success is, and success is more people. So we answer it as an aspirational piece. And you've already stated, if we don't want those people, those new people, then we actually sabotage it. And we don't set out to do that intentionally. It's just that that's who we are and what we do. If we're able to name that up front, being emotionally healthy to be able to name that up front, then we can move forward, whether it's as that congregation or as a new congregation in the community. We're able to move forward to be for the community what God needs a church to do and be for the community. It's okay to be 45 people and care for yourselves. It's not okay to say we're 45 people and we care for the community, and the community doesn't ever get connected to the church.
Right. I would say that what you just described, Tim, isn't about being emotionally literate or illiterate. It's about telling lies and stories to yourself about, and not really naming and claiming what the current reality is, and naming the facts of what is happening. You're fooling yourself. And if you want to get scriptural on that, it's all about wearing a mask. And if you're wearing a mask, what's the Greek word that I'm thinking of that really is it's a mask.
You wouldn't be using the word hypocrite, would you?
That's what it is. Yes. That's exactly what I'm thinking of.
Sarah, I didn't mean to take us down another path. It's just the idea of being emotionally healthy, or having, if we're going to use the word emotional literacy, then I guess we could be emotionally illiterate, because we're not being true to ourselves and the feelings that we have that give direction to the thoughts that then put the actions into place. So it works backwards just the same way. If what we're doing is cutting ourselves off from the community, and we're thinking, well, I really don't want more people here, and what I'm feeling is it really feels uncomfortable to see new people, then we're just living into what we want to happen.
Bing, 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 bing. So emotional literacy drives our actions and our inactions. It fuels the results that we get or fail to get. It helps us move forward, or it keeps us right where we're at. And if we want people to lead with courage, you now see why I keep saying you need to create the space where people can name and own, here's what I'm feeling and what I'm thinking, because what you just described, Tim, I think is all too common in our local churches. And we haven't created spaces for people to be able to name that. And I'm being a bit dramatic, but it's also the truth. So they lie through their teeth about what they really want. And it's not helping anyone move to a new place or to recognize the stage of life that the local congregation is, so that we can help then resource that church for that stage of life and provide the type of leadership that they actually need. But if you're playing the compare game and comparing a church of 45 people to a church of 1,000 people, you are emotionally bruising yourself every stinking day. And you are not going to be a healthy leader, and your congregation is not going to be healthy, because the leadership that you're providing is coming from a false place and not recognizing the circumstances that are around you.
So really, one way that we can become healthy, as you've said, is create the space for the conversation. And you've actually put together some materials and resources to help do that in our congregations, haven't you?
Yes, I have. And you can find those and download those at transformingmission.org/061. As we think about emotional literacy, if you want people to be healthy and not live outside of their emotions in places of addiction and numbing and avoidance and indulging in a whole lot of other behaviors and actions, you need to help create the spaces where people can name what they're feeling, describe what's going on inside of them, and we need to be people who help people name the good and the bad. If we don't ever talk about the good, the bad, and I say the ugly, it's likely, if we're not talking about all of the emotions, we're probably not talking about any of them. Because if you're going to feel, you need to have the good and you need to have the bad. And as leaders, we need to create the space to help people process what they're feeling and thinking and doing or not doing, so that you can live into that future that you want. So on a regular basis, if you find yourself managing ineffective or unproductive behavior on your team or in yourself, it's probably time to get curious about what you're feeling and to simply ask folks, what is it that you're feeling? I've said it over and over and over again, but I'll say it again. Our emotions drive our action or our inactions. Our thoughts drive our emotions that lead to our actions or our inactions. So if you want to change the future, you need to get clear on what you're feeling and on your thoughts and on your actions. Otherwise, you're going to stay in the land of either not trying again or find ways to continue to procrastinate or sabotage. And I think doing nothing is worse than failing. If you try, there's no failure. But if you're not paying attention to what you're feeling, it's likely you don't know how it's driving your actions or inactions. So if you want to be emotionally literate, you need to know what the core emotions are. You need to be able to name them when they're coming up for yourself, for others, and during the difficult moments that you're navigating together. So since we've been talking about emotional literacy, and I just went on a little preaching tangent there, Tim, what other thoughts or feelings do you have?
Sarah, I appreciate the work that you're doing, and what I really want to do is invite those listening to take a risk, and that risk is to step into the reality of their feelings and to own those feelings and to allow those feelings to lead them into the places of making disciples, connecting with their communities. It's not, for some reason in the church, there are some people who feel like that it's just less than human to feel. But if we could ever get our heads and hearts together and own our feelings, I think, let's do it this way. You've put together some wonderful things to help us move forward. So I'm just inviting people to take the risk to move forward.
And in the next episode next week, we'll offer an opportunity to help you take the feelings and help translate those into how they might be informed by your values. Because often what happens is our emotions are driven by our values. And so that's where we're heading in episode 62. This episode, let me remind you, is brought to you by Transforming Mission. We help Christian leaders deepen your relationships with Christ, the congregation, and your surrounding community. And you can find resources for this episode at transformingmission.org/061. And let me remind you, as I always do, go lead a movement of Jesus followers. Bye for now.